This conference will now be recorded.
Hi, everybody. It is 1 p.m. on Thursday, March 26th, and I'm talking to you guys now, and these are crazy times. I'm not going to belabor that point, but I have a job to do, and my job is to try to provide an educational experience to you guys. I realize how completely unsatisfying it is to listen to me drone on. I'm going to present these slides, talk my way through these slides. I'm going to talk about environmental programs in the Colorado River. I'm sitting in my office at home. We'll go for about 20 minutes. I'm going to leave you with some discussion comments or questions, just like David did on the previous assignment. Let's see if this works. We can shift to synchronous conversation over the computer if need be, but enough of that. All right. So what I want to talk about today is the environmental programs of the Colorado River Basin. Here is a map of the Colorado River, and the big programs are the Upper Colorado River Endangered Fish Recovery Program, the San Juan River Basin Recovery Implementation Program, the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program. This is mislabeled. This should say Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program. Whoops. The Lower Colorado River Multi-Species Conservation Program. These are the big programs that affect every part of the river. And what I'd like you to do is take a look back at the Schmidt 2007 reading that you read in the first week or two of the class, and just look at pages 215 to 217. And then I'm posting a new reading, Schmidt 2010. You can look at table 1 of that paper for a listing of these programs. The genesis of all of these environmental programs, in many ways, is the passage of the Endangered Species Act. And I've listed here a number of acts that existed earlier in the 20th century that were around as the Colorado River Storage Project and Hoover Dam and the law of the river were developed. And my point here is for you to realize that there's been an underlying sort of concern about the environment that has been expressed through legislation that's existed throughout the 20th century. And so this slide, like many others that I'm going to present to you, I'm giving to you for reference. Here is a listing of some of those acts, beginning as early as the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act of 1934. The Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973, and in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, a number of great pieces of environmental legislation were passed because there was a societal consensus amongst Republicans and Democrats that we ought to be more concerned as a society with the condition of the environment. The Endangered Species Act was passed by the House of Representatives by a vote of 355 to 4. It was passed in the Senate by voice vote with no opposition. That act was signed by President Richard Nixon, a Republican. And it's my way of saying it was a time when there was a much broader consensus of the importance of environmental protection. It wasn't as much of a hot button divisive issue as it is today. The primary focus of the act ultimately was to prevent the extinction of species in the United States. I've listed the key sections of the Endangered Species Act just so you have this for reference. And I'm not going to go into this. Many of you have had other natural resources classes that have covered this material, but I just want to point out that Section 7 says that federal agencies cannot jeopardize the continued existence of endangered or threatened species, and that the operation of facilities, as well as the construction of those facilities, might create jeopardy. Why is this important? It's important because it means that, Hoover was built, Glen Canyon Dam was built, and the public policy might have been to say, well, we built the dams, it's too late, we didn't consider the effects then, and so it doesn't matter now, and we're going to do whatever we want to. No, this act says that the operations of Flaming Gorge Dam, the operations of Glen Canyon Dam can create jeopardy, and if there's jeopardy, there has to be formal consultation. You see this with the Fish and Wildlife Service. That means Reclamation and the Fish and Wildlife Service, two different agencies of the Interior Department, have to talk between themselves so as to eliminate jeopardy so that we don't lose species. With passage of the Endangered Species Act, the humpback chub and the Colorado squawfish, now called the Colorado pike minnow, were immediately listed as endangered species. And these two species of fish live in the main stem Colorado River and are directly affected by the construction and operation of dams. The razorback sucker, another big river Colorado River fish, was listed in 1991 and the bony tail in 1980. What is important about these four fish is these fish are not only endangered, but you should know that they are endemic to the Colorado River, meaning they live nowhere else on Earth. They only live in the Colorado River and nowhere else. Well, after passage of the Act in 1973, operations of all those dams continued, and states like Colorado and every upper basin state, every lower basin state continued to build and divert diversions and divert water to Denver, divert water elsewhere in the watershed to Albuquerque, to Salt Lake City. And the Fish and Wildlife Service, with every one of those activities, kept observing that those depletions adversely affected these endangered species. So they observed all of these things that I've listed here that you can look at. But the main point is there were adverse impacts of diversions anticipated by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So throughout the later 1970s and 1980s, the Fish and Wildlife Service kept saying, hold it, this is adversely affecting the fish, and we're supposed to enforce the Endangered Species Act. And so they kept writing jeopardy opinions, but importantly, no project ever got canceled. They kept saying this is hurting the fish, and we need something to mitigate, you to do something to mitigate the adverse effects. And typically the commitments were that some releases from new reservoirs being built would offset the depletions, at least during the base flow time of year. The message here is you can read the details of this. I don't need to repeat this. You should read this story. But the story is basically that every development in the watershed was saying, well, Fish and Wildlife Service says, well, you got to do something. And so they were doing little bits of things, but the problem was that it was a haphazard problem, or it was a haphazard way to deal with things. In 1981, the Windy Gap process was developed in the state of Colorado, and those developers said, we can't even give you downstream water to help the fish. We're going to give you money to develop some sort of, to better fund your program. And so that was a process that developed. It went on through the 1980s. And so we sort of shifted gears. Instead of providing water for fish, the developers and the proponents said, well, we can't even necessarily give you that, but we'll give you money. And then you can develop a program to do things. You might think that that's buying off the system. That's your call. But that's sort of how the process worked. The main message is it was haphazard. In 1988, everybody involved said, hold it, this is crazy. This is too haphazard. Let's create a formal program. The Upper Colorado River Endangered Fish Recovery Program was created. And basically, it created a central clearinghouse to evaluate the effects of proposals to develop water, and yet tried to develop a coordinated program by which the fish activities would go on in the watershed that would help the fish and keep them from going extinct. And that's what this program is. And that program has continued to this day. And what is important is that this program is a partnership, and is a partnership of federal agencies, state agencies, water and power interests, and environmental groups who seek to recover the endangered fish of the Colorado River Basin. But here's what's super important: while water development proceeds. So this is a program which says, we're going to try to do good by the species, but we are going to allow continued upper basin water development to proceed. So those of you who want to call the glass half full or half empty, you can sort of say, sounds great, it doesn't jeopardize water development. Or you can say, hold it, is this some sort of crazy program to pretend that you can have your cake and eat it too? You can be skeptics. You can read work that I've made available, and you can do some of the readings to take that under consideration. Here are the formal program partners: State of Utah, State of Wyoming, State of Colorado, Bureau of Reclamation, a lobbying group for hydropower users, a lobbying group for water depletion, an enviro group, the Nature Conservancy, an advocacy group for water depletions in the state of Utah, Western Area Power, Clayton Palmer works for them, Western Resource Advocates is an enviro group, Wyoming Water Association is a pro-development group. So you got everybody involved at the table. Reclamation puts in most of the money. And this program, this has a number of different program elements, identifying the in-stream needs of how much water fish need. Spoiler alert, fish need some water. They can't live in no water. But restore habitat, deal with non-natives, try to raise endangered fish in hatcheries, do research and monitoring. Now, I'm not going to read the details of this. You should read this slide later in this presentation. And my message to you is it's a big, involved program, and it necessitates collaboration between the states, the water developers, the hydropower users, and the enviro groups to try to work together. And it's generally viewed as a somewhat successful program. I just want you to know it exists. Stop. Now let's go to Grand Canyon. In Grand Canyon, we've looked at this slide, which is a history of the flow regime of the Grand Canyon. Here are the big ups and downs. Here's when we had the big flow years in the mid-1980s. Environmental concern kept growing, and something called the Grand Canyon Protection Act was passed in 1992 because environmental concerns particularly expanded in this period after the mid-1980s. The flow regime was somewhat changed. Here's the controlled flood. We'll talk about that, the 1996 flood at a later time. But the Grand Canyon Protection Act was passed in 1992, and it had these objectives: to protect, mitigate adverse impacts to, and improve the values for which Grand Canyon National Park and Glen Canyon NRA were established. It required the Secretary of the Interior to establish and implement a long-term monitoring program. And here's the kicker: the Secretary shall implement this act in a manner fully consistent and subject to the law of the river, including Colorado River Storage Project Act, which was the basis of building Glen Canyon Dam. So in some ways, this act is no different than what was involved in getting the Upper Basin Fish Recovery Program going. And that's that. We're trying to help the environment in this legislation, but it says, but you got to do it within the confines of the law of the river. This is water supply and water development. This is the new stuff, environment. And needless to say, different people disagree on whether the Grand Canyon Protection Act should change the way the Colorado River is managed to emphasize these environmental issues more, or whether this means business as usual, keep fulfilling all the needs of the dams and water supply, and do a little bit of good, but don't screw around with the law of the river. That's controversy. I want you to think about that. But needless to say, all of this legislation always says we want to have the environment, but don't screw around with water supply. It's a complicated balance of the two. In 1995, there was an environmental impact statement done on Glen Canyon Dam operations, and part of the record decision of that EIS was that there should be a new goal for operating the dam so as to maximize the benefits for the most river resources and try to help the environment, but only limit if hydropower is a problem to adversely affect the downstream environment, only tweak with hydropower just enough to get some benefit. Needless to say, I'm trying to show you how sort of uncertain and how kind of ambiguous are some of these goals. It created an adaptive management program for the Grand Canyon that is a collaborative science-based integration, and notice to make formal recommendations to the Secretary of the Interior. Now, what I want you to see here is I want you to see that the program in Grand Canyon says, think about the downstream environment, but don't mess with water supply. Think about the downstream environment, but only affect hydropower a little bit, and make recommendations on how you should change. Notice that this says nothing explicitly about the endangered fish. It says think about all the resources that go on in Grand Canyon. So just realize it's a little bit different. The Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program is a program that makes recommendations to the Secretary of the Interior. The Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program does not control how the dam is operated. It just says Tell the Secretary of Interior what you'd like, and the Secretary of Interior will make the decision of what to do. Realize that that's how it works. The buck still stops with the Secretary of the Interior. These are all the entities who are formal members of the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program as it is presently configured. 5 tribes that have spiritual connection to Grand Canyon. The 7 states of the Colorado River Basin. Representatives of the environmental community. Now, American Rivers and the Grand Canyon Wildlands Council. 2 representatives of hydropower consumers, Colorado River Energy Distributors Association, Utah Association of Municipal Power Systems. And then 2 recreational interests, one, the Federation of Fly Fishermen, who has a focus on the tailwater trout fishery, and the other is Grand Canyon River Guides, who has a focus on whitewater boating. And we would have gone to the annual spring meeting of the Grand Canyon River Guides had we been allowed to travel to Lee's Ferry this weekend. So, lots of different interests. The Grand Canyon Monitoring and Research Center is an arm of the U.S. Geological Survey that is charged with doing the science work to inform the decisions of this group. And this is the federal bureau or agency that I served as chief of and led this agency for 3.5 years during the Obama administration. This is an agency with a $10 million a year budget and also funds a number of projects by collaborating agencies. I just want to speak for a minute about the concept of adaptive management. That is what the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program is charged with undertaking. That concept was articulated in books, most primarily by a fish biologist by the name of Carl Walters, who spent his career at the University of British Columbia, and by other people who sort of advocated that we don't, in many environmental systems, we really don't know enough to describe a formal prescribed solution for the way to operate a facility like a dam. Every policy is itself an experiment, and every experiment needs to be measured, and then we need to iterate and learn from that experiment, change the policy, run a new experiment, on we go. That's the philosophy of adaptive management, and the point is, the articulation of that came in the mid-1980s, and that's when the Grand Canyon Protection Act in the early 90s was passed. So it was like, this is the best science. Let's identify a process of policy iteration and then develop a program based on that. These are many themes in the literature of adaptive management. And the main point is here is that it's learning by doing. And you can read these common themes at your leisure. Adaptive management is only one kind of approach to natural resource management. And again, it emphasizes experimentation. And I don't want to duplicate the courses that are already taken by each of the natural resources students in our class. This is old hat to them, but to all of the engineers, just realize this is a new cutting edge process that we now think about. It's a sort of a cutting edge for the future way to approach managing resources. The problem in developing policies and conducting experiments in the Grand Canyon is that the best experiments would include repetition. would include repeated running of the same experiment to see whether you get the same response, would be to identify a program of experiment that might go out 5 or 10 years. And the problem is that you can't really do that because every drop of water that goes through Grand Canyon isn't an experiment. It's water that's headed to California and Arizona and Mexico for people to use that year. And we have wet years and we have dry years. And the Bureau of Reclamation is trying to figure out how to operate Glen Canyon Dam to pass water and meet water supply. And so you might think about developing experiments as if the only people managing the river are ecologists, but that isn't the way it works, right? It's also a water supply. And so there have been a lot of critiques of adaptive management, referring to it as adaptive management light, says that it's kind of adaptive management, but you're trying to do the best you can. But most importantly, pay attention to this iterative process. And the important point for you all to realize is that operations at Glen Canyon today are not just undertaken to meet water supply and hydropower. They also have to live in this world of trying to do the best by the river environmental resources below the dam. The last big program I wanted to point to is a Lower Colorado River multi-species conservation program that exists to try to make the world a better place between Hoover Dam and Yuma. And it was authorized in 2009. The funding is more than $600 million, half of it paid for by the federal government, much of the rest funded by the state of California. And the single most important point about this program is that the program is focused on recreating habitat, not in recovering species. Why? Well, the Lower Colorado River between Hoover Dam and Yuma is a pretty transformed place. You're taking water out all the time. You should reread the readings that I've given you about how much water is taken out. We have virtually no water in the river at Yuma. We've made a commitment to developing the river and turning half of the dam place into reservoirs. So you're not going to remove those reservoirs. You're not going to stop taking water to Los Angeles or Phoenix. And so, to be frank, the program here is a much more achievable thing. It's like, well, we can make some new cottonwood and willow forest. We can make some new mesquite forest. We hope it'll help the species. And if it doesn't, we're going to keep doing what we did. So you might consider that a good idea or a bad idea, but that's the way we've decided as a society to proceed. Stocked a lot of fish. Some of the species are doing well, yellow-billed cuckoos. One other thing that's really important about this program is it's not just about fish down there. It's about birds and snakes and other things. You should look on the website. I've given you here the websites where you can access information about each of these programs, and you might do so. All right, let me just finish with this. We've been going nearly 30 minutes. I have asked you to read for this assignment one other important note you should look in the schedule of classes. This is an article, Schmidt et al., 1998. It's called Science and Values in Restoring the Colorado River and Grand Canyon. You need to read that article. It's a very influential article, and here's the guts of it, and then you should read it to be prepared to answer the discussion questions. The literature on stream restoration says, if you're going to run an effective stream restoration or environmental management program, you need a guiding image of what your goal is. In the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program, you got all those stakeholders, right? Remember all those stakeholders who we had involved. Here they all are. And we said, well, here you all are. What do you want the river to be in the future? And if you think about this, the tribes might want one objective. The states might want water supply. The enviro groups might want one thing. The trout fishermen might want one thing. The hydro energy guys might want one thing. And in fact, when they all got together and said, let's work together, they identified this set of objectives for what they wanted the river to be. And the essence of the Schmidt et al. Article is that these objectives, which all sound great, can be separated into some attributes of the river that were what we called relics of the past, the endangered or extirpated species, and the cultural resources left by the tribes who once lived there. Those are relics that are holding on of what the river used to be like before there were dams. And then there are other attributes that are only there because of the dam, like the rainbow trout fishery. And we explore this. Now or maximize hydropower. And what we say in that article is, you can't have it all. You can't actually have the goals of bringing back everything that used to be there and pursue the goals of everything that's there because there are dams. You can't have it both ways. We went through the same exercise in 2013 and identified, again, what are all the values that we want for Grand Canyon? And here they all are in shorthand. And you're going to see the same thing when you look carefully at this and think about that Schmidt et al. Article. And that's that there are attributes that are because of dams, and there are attributes because of the of the past. And what we said was, science can't answer a way to maximize all of this. Human values have to decide what you want, and whether and how hard the fight is to achieve those goals depends on the mix of pre-dam and post-dam resources. And so look at this slide in your leisure. The job of scientists and engineers, like every one of you in the room or listening to this talk, you have jobs to be the best eco-scientist you can be. And that's part of what we do, and that's part of CRSS modeling, that's part of ecosystem science research. That's the job of scientists. But the one thing that scientists can't do is decide what is the mix, what is the goal. Read that article and think about it. And then consider these two discussion questions that I want you to write me a paragraph or two on Canvas in the same way you're communicating with David, and let's have a conversation about this. I want you to read that Schmidt et al. Article, and I want you to tell me what you think should be the appropriate environmental management goal for the Colorado River and Grand Canyon. And here are some considerations. You just answer this in a paragraph, but think about this. To what degree should we be informed by the river of the past? To what degree should we care about the fact that the river is in Grand Canyon National Park and we have something called the Grand Canyon Protection Act? To what degree should we say, hold it, guys, there's dams and water supply. It's crazy to care whether it's a national park or not. We've got the law of the river to worry about. So anyway, look at those things and you tell me what you think is the goal and what should that goal be. Because you, every one of you listening to this, is a citizen of the United States and you can have an opinion. Then I want you to write me a paragraph for each one of your groups. What do you think the appropriate environmental management goal should be for the part of the river that you're worried about? Some of you are working on the Salton Sea. Some of you are working on the Delta. Some of you are working on the structural deficit and the lower river between Hoover and Yuma. Some of you are working on the Green River. The management goal is going to be different, and you need to think about these things I've written in white, and then tell me what you think and whether you think what the balance between environmental considerations, water supply, hydropower, what do you think we ought to decide for a democracy? Okay, have a great time. Next time we'll do something else. If you're still listening, great. I'm doing the best I can. David's doing the best he can. You're doing the best you can. Know that we care about you. We want you all to be healthy emotionally, physically. We care about you a lot. Stay healthy, be strong. On we go.